that cannot form part of the existing perceptual world. This step is again counterinductive. And I guess it's precisely, if I had to say what I'm trying to teach, or what I'm becoming more interested in working on in the context of the school, is precisely what Feyerabend calls the counterinductive, but what I would call the counterintuitive. To develop techniques and forms of counterintuition. Because I think it's the only way to overcome the kinds of platitudes and assumed certainties, really as a way of expanding the possibility. I mean, one of the things that Feyerabend says is that you need an alternative theory, a fictional theory, in order to uncover facts. Basically, if you operate under the dominant theory, you can only see and uncover the facts that follow that model. So the only way to even understand this, a presumed real world, if you thought one exists, was in fact through the proliferation of alternative hypotheses or counterfactuals, what I would also start to include as what-if scenarios, thought experiments. That's the counterintuitive strength of architecture. So when we see this image, of course, we know this image because it's also become a cliche of the current moment, which is to say, this is what we would need in terms of resources if the rest of the world consumed at the rate of the U.S. This is the 4-Earth image. We would need 4 globes. And the moral lesson of this globe is, of course, we need to reduce our footprint. There are a number of assumptions in this, and to be counterintuitive also requires one, frankly, to be politically incorrect. There's no other way to say it. And in fact, so I think that political incorrectness is a particular form of advance of science and certainly of the design discipline. And we have to be, frankly, extreme about that. So, the lesson is smaller footprint. And I think that there's no right that the U.S. has to consume resources, but I'm not sure that the assumption inherent in the model, which is that resources should be consumed equally everywhere, is necessarily the kind of world that one wants to live in either. In other words, that the advances may in fact require disequilibrium in terms of resource allocation. So there are assumptions here, but I think as a designer you have to say, forget the smaller footprint morale of the image. I think what attracts us as designer, I will say unconsciously, is basically, wow, 4 Earths, that's pretty cool. Let's face it, it's the graphic that we're seduced by, the fact that there are 4 worlds. And I think that, again, to borrow Feyerabend, that's what architects do. We project and invent alternative worlds. These are 4 projects done by Alex Lerner, a member of our faculty, over the summer for an exhibition on the open city at the NAI. These were actually cities. These were spherically modeled new forms of city for the Open City show in Rotterdam. But I think that this is precisely the idea of how we invent alternative worlds, that's our job, and to project those alternatives, to multiply Earths, at least conceptually. There was also I realized a workshop that we did a year and a half ago with Neil Denari called Alternative Chicago. I brought Neil in for a 4-day workshop, and in 4 days you can't do much, so he basically gave them Google Earth and Photoshop. They were the only 2 tools they could use, and they had to then develop alternative Chicagos and write scenarios about how those alternative Chicagos came to be. It's kind of hyper-realist planning, photorealist master planning. This was like a Venice, Chicago, I suppose. You have to understand, this was not taken well in this school in the city. Surprise. The fact is that people in Chicago don't like people from outside to come in and do things in Chicago, as I discovered. This may take, this was another one. It looks like it was a kind of bridge to Michigan. This is one of my favorites, Battle Island, which would be to take all the sports facilities offshore and put them together. And then Jane Mansfield Park. But I think that, again, this, in the broad sense of how we invent alternative worlds, that's what we do. Now, this is a slight shift in the rant and maybe to the issue of territory. I would say that that's one form of territorializing, our invention of alternative worlds and the kinds of economies and audiences and plastic resource distribution and formal organization that goes along with those alternative worlds. There's a quote by Mark Wigley. I don't write about architects today because I think they write. I would rather read an architect than read a critic on the architect's work. I have never read anyone who writes about Koolhaas's work that's interesting. I did, Mark. In any case, and so he's probably right. I think that this is the kind of abdication of a territory that I find problematic. And what I mean by, we're at a moment, I think, the late 60s and early 70s, were interesting in the sense that there was a lot of genre swapping. In terms of the expansion of territory, architects would do different things. They would write, polemicize, create institutions, write about other architects, their own work, historical figures, and they would also design. I think today we're in a world of specialization, and it's precisely that specialization that I think also leads to this idy world of focus on facts and conditions. That the rise of the specialist, so we have the digital specialist, the technology specialist, the PhD scholar specialist, but we've abandoned any possible generalist field that I think is really what we own as a field. In fact, I think that, again, in these economic times, let's say, increasing demand for universities to put every unit on its own bottom, or for students or parents to basically say, that's great, but how much are they going to make when they graduate? I mean, it's a funny thing. It was never a question that I or my generation, I think, asked ourselves when we started flirting with higher education, like what was in it at the end in terms of a paycheck. And clearly we know where that ends up now. But I think this kind of new idea that universities have to be instrumental, which is really the death of the liberal arts and the death of a certain kind of model of undergraduate education in terms of the economics of it. And this is something that's been a kind of widespread, in other words, the sciences, the foundations that fund themselves, the hospitals, every ship on its own bottom means research dollars that support programs and students and so on, and that clearly the liberal arts are not able to generate that sort of revenue, and so basically we are having a kind of, I would say, shrinkage of the liberal arts. I think the interesting thing, this is just one last aside, is that in universities, in the context of the university, I think the School of Architecture is the last place where you can actually do the liberal arts. In other words, because of the Trojan horse of the professional education, you could sneak in a liberal arts education. It's the last professional education, unlike business, law, medicine, that, let's face it, their coursework is quite narrow in terms of its breadth. When you go to architecture school, you're in structures, you're doing calculations, you're in design studio, you're writing papers in history theory. You basically recapitulated the entire liberal arts model under the guise of professional education. So we may be lucky, but we have to kind of argue for our particular place in the academy because of that. In any case, I find Wigley's abdication irresponsible. And I think it contributes to the idea that we have PhD scholars and architects over here. And at the conference I was at, it really did reproduce that split between designers and really historians, not even theorists, let alone critics. But I think that the problem with Wigley's comment is that it leads to bad criticism. In other words, we've left the field of the generalist critic, and so we end up with essentially bloggers. Let's face it, bloggers give vanity press a good name. Blogging is not a criteria to get published. But in Chicago, apparently, at least in the Chicago Reader, if you have a blog on architecture but have